So, this probably is going to sound a little more disjointed than most of my videos usually do, and I apologize in advance for that. I've just got thoughts that are all over the place. And I suppose I could make the joke about that being about an episode called Displaced, but whatever, moving on. Let's jump right into this. First of all, this is a weird thing to compliment, but I just gotta say, really great set work in this episode. They actually only used, in addition to Voyager's set, they actually only used 3 additional sets. But they did a really good job with lighting, camera work, and angles in order to basically make it feel like more than just the same 3 sets repeating over and over. Really, really good job on that, and definite props. I also want to give props to the graphics design department. I've talked about them before. They did a really good job of basically creating the other environments. Every now and again they would show off another environment. Okay, here's the jungle, and here's the desert. And it was literally just stuff that would be on the screen for a few seconds, but the fact that they went that extra mile to really show it and let us see what it looked like, that was good stuff. Really helped flesh it out. So, a lot of credit to the behind-the-scenes people. The director of this episode really did a great job, too. But I'm getting ahead of myself. I'm going to talk about most of the episode stuff first, and then I'm going to talk about some implications and some thoughts that this episode provoked in me last. So, usual format, I suppose. Excuse me. The original... not the original intent, that's the wrong way to say it. The director of this episode, who did a really good job with it again, really wanted to do the episode in a different light. He wanted to make this episode the Twilight Zone classic, To Serve Man. If you don't know what that is, well, actually, in all honesty, you probably do know what that is, even though it is actually probably you have never actually seen that episode, because a lot of Twilight Zone has entered into so much of popular culture that it's hard to avoid, even if you've never actually perceived it. That's not a slight, it's just the reality of it. But the idea here, in brief, is the idea that he really wanted the Nerians to actually be cooking the sentience that they were capturing, and the idea was actually floated out during the writing and scripting stages, and it was immediately shot down. Forgive me for pointing this out, but like I said back in The Darkling, I agree, I think that would have been going over the line. And just like I said back then, knowing where that line is debatable, and admittedly what the Nerians are doing in this episode is actually pretty deplorable in its own way. They are literally taking the Velvet Prison concept to its logical conclusion. But, at the same time, going over that line would have probably pushed them into, oh my god, what the hell territory, and probably would have bothered more than a few people. Now, I like the intro. More Tom, more Taurus. There's actually a fairly large amount of Tom Paris and B'Elanna Torres in this episode. Excuse me, I'm still recovering from something here. One of the benefits, detriments, one of the hazards of taking care of a 2-year-old is you get sick basically every week. Usually it's just small stuff. Anyways, I'm getting off topic. A lot of Tom and Taurus stuff in this episode, and they're not the only ones, and I'll talk about that concept a little bit later, but there's some really good stuff in this episode, and I feel like there's 3 big reasons why it really succeeded, because they have several scenes basically dedicated to them. Reason 1 it succeeded is the obvious. Both actors have an amazing chemistry with each other. It's no wonder they decided to go ahead and move those 2 characters closer to each other, because they really do work really well with each other. Number 2, I've talked about this constantly. Ever since they first started the very first hints of the B'Elanna and Tom Paris relationship, and that's the fact that it's not actually romantic. Think about this for a moment. I know what you're thinking, especially if you've seen Voyager before. I know some of you are going to look at me and be weird and just think I'm crazy, but rewatch the episode sometime. I know that as someone who has has watched Voyager multiple times, you look back and it's like, obviously it's about the relationship, but really analyzing it with, my analysis mode on, as I like to call it, at no point in time was any of their dynamics romantic. It was all about their friendship. And honestly, I've always felt that that's one of the 2 big reasons why their relationship actually worked. The first is the slow boil, which I've talked about a billion times, and the second is the fact that they were friends first, and they had an arc of friendship. They didn't just start off as friends; they built up to friendship. It is debatable that this episode is the first episode in which B'Elanna and Tom actually become friends. The two of them have been circling each other forever, and finally she lets her defenses down just enough, and he, keeps trying just hard enough that they actually become friends at the coda of this episode. I know I'm skipping ahead, way ahead. It's actually my last note on the page here. Love the coda of this episode, because that's what really hammered it in. It really is all about their friendship. The way she comes out there, the way she asks her question. Rewatch the coda, seriously. At no point does she actually say a question, but you can tell what she's asking. She is, it was getting pretty chilly there for a while, but things seem to have warmed up now. And she kind of leaves that hanging there, and Tom confirms, yeah, it feels nice for things to be warm again, and then she gets all relaxed. It was a perfect way for B'Elanna to, in her own nervous shell, insular way, try to open up just a teensy bit and ask, despite all that we just went through, are you still willing to be my friend? And his positive response had such a positive reaction in her that it was just awesome. I loved it. I loved that coda. That's the second reason. The third reason I feel like the way it works in this episode has to do with the fact that they don't spend all of the episode focusing on it, and they don't spend all of their scenes focusing on it either. Plenty of their scenes are just about the crisis they're dealing with and them trying to logic through the question, and then there's the scenes where it's about them and their friendship and all that stuff. So 3 reasons. I love the you know what, I'm actually going to leave that for later. I'm going to talk more about the Nerians and their methods later when I talk about the cultural implications and the thought exercise. I'm not sure what to say about this. There's a 12-minute escalation. For those of you who don't know what that means in television terms, the first act is the escalation. Now, that's almost never done. You almost always do escalation through Act 1 through 3, and then resolution in Act 4. That's the standard formula, and Star Trek is very adherent to the standard formula, not just in Voyager. In this one, they have the escalation in Act 1, and then the resolution goes across Act 2 through 4. But it actually works really, really well because this episode is a character piece. Lisa Klink actually wrote this. Remember that name? I mentioned her forever ago when she did some incredibly bad episodes. She certainly found a little bit more of her chops, and indeed she's not the only one. A lot of the Voyager writing staff will get better as the series goes on, in my opinion, in their writing talents, and she's a good example of this. This whole episode is really a character piece, and yet she does something that so many writers have never really understood. See, you could say there's an A and a B plot in this episode, but there isn't. There is only one plot of this episode, and that's what she does right. Well, this episode, which is all about character dynamics and character attention, very, very character growth heavy, right? And very focused on the characters and their interactions with each other and the situation. At no point in time is there a B plot or a C plot or whatever trying to drag that forward like is often done. Instead, the A plot is dragging that forward, in addition to putting them in trouble, in addition to putting the ship in trouble, etc., etc. I've said it before and I've said it again, mandating something, anything, is generally a bad idea. See what I did there? So the mandatory, you have to have a threat to the ship thing in the writing thing bugs me. But that is not to say that it is automatically a bad thing either. And this is a great example of that. The fact that they actually are in trouble and in danger. I just have to share a thought, and I definitely want to hear your guys' thoughts on this. I always love hearing your guys' feedback on these episodes. Really, I do. I read every one of them while I'm watching a 2-year-old. Which is why I don't respond all the time. But seriously, I read all of them. This is the first episode across Voyager thus far where I really felt the tension and danger of the scenes. Specifically, I am talking about when Chakotay was on Voyager by himself in Act 1. That felt genuinely tense and genuinely suspenseful. Like, I understood the gravity of the situation, I understood what was happening, and I was in the moment, you know what I mean? And it's the first scene, as I've been going through this whole series so far, that really gripped me like that. So I'm curious of your guys' feedback on that as well. While I'm talking about that, though, this is a great time to talk about the fact that this episode is an amazing Chakotay piece, which is funny because Chakotay basically ceases to be a character after Act 1. It's kind of funny because basically it goes like this. A lot of focus on Chakotay, a little bit of focus on Tom and Taurus here and there, a little bit of focus on Tuvok and Janeway here and there. One brief scene, one awesome scene between Chakotay and Tuvok, and then the rest is mostly guest star fluffing out, with Harry having like one scene, and Kes having like one scene, Neelix having one scene. But a couple things. A, the effort was made to make sure everyone at least had something to do with what's going on. That was literally a deliberate intent, by the way. Lisa Klink went on record saying she was trying to make this an ensemble piece. And given the limitations, I think she did a pretty good job of that. But two, again, if you asked me, almost every Voyager episode stuck very hard to the formula of this episode is about character A, and occasionally character A and character B. That it's most often two. These two characters are the main characters. This episode never, at no point did I feel like it was primarily about two characters. There was a lot of focus spread out all over the place. You could make an argument for Tom and Taurus, but I'm not sure I'd agree with that. It's debatable, but I liked the attempt, if nothing else. I like the attempt at doing something new. Getting back to the Chakotay stuff. The Chakotay stuff on Voyager was pure gold. Again, I feel like this was the best Chakotay stuff probably in the whole series so far, and I mean this sincerely. This was Chakotay truly in his element. He was in command of a small, outnumbered, outgunned, out-technologied, out-resourced fighting force. You see where I'm going with this. Trying to subvert them because he knew for a fact he could not defeat them, trying to accomplish the best he could with the limited time he had, and it really got to show off Chakotay. He was very clever, very cunning, figured out what to do, didn't hesitate for a second. We saw his command and his leadership skills on display. It was all just top-notch. And then when he had to go commando completely by himself, it was amazing. And the final idea he had with getting the Doctor into the mobile emitter, palming it, just in time for him to transport, yeah, that was awesome. And really, really great. And if you think about it, if he hadn't done that, they wouldn't have been able to modify the Doctor, then find the portal, then reprogram the thing. So, yeah, Chakotay just saved the ship. Now, you could argue that in several cases if Taurus hadn't reprogrammed the Doctor. If the Doctor didn't have that, it wasn't holographic. If Janeway and Tuvok had nothing, blah, blah, blah. But honestly, I think we're going to go and give props to Chakotay here for that amazing feat of cunning, basically, under duress. Which is also what I've always felt of as my perception of Chakotay. That kind of, frankly, Kirk style of mentality. Does his best when he's under pressure, kind of a thing, right? And I really wish that more Voyager had done that. I would have loved to see episodes which explored the idea of Chakotay literally balking or buckling or otherwise not being able to deal with utter mundane stuff. Crew manifests and duty rosters and just basic ordinary stuff was just kind of... He couldn't take it. He couldn't deal with it. And I don't mean like, oh, it's overwhelming. I mean, he had no skill with it. He was considered a ineffectual leader to the point where he was losing morale with the crew, and then a crisis happens, and bam, he's right back on his A game. And again, pretty much single-handedly saved the ship. I know he didn't literally sing it, but, linchpin, right? And that's why Chakotay is such a valued member of the crew. You see where I'm going with that idea? That's always been my personal interpretation of him, and I think this episode had a lot to do with that. I also want to talk about two big things that I really liked about this episode. Number one, Janeway wasn't an idiot. And I know, you're looking at me like, oh my god, what? Seriously though, Janeway actually recognized the potential threat that she was in. Now keep in mind, we the viewers recognize the threat because we've watched Star Trek before. Star Trek actually kind of copied this idea from Twilight Zone, deliberately I might add. That was actually one of the intents back in the original series, to copy the A, oh no it's B thing. And Twilight Zone is arguably one of the biggest things that pioneered that type of storytelling in television when it came to, especially when it comes to science fiction. And so, we got there's these people and they show up and they're totally innocent and they're just helpless and they have no idea what's going on. So of course the viewer's like, oh, something horrible's happening. And yet, so rarely do the cast members, the actual in-character characters, think, maybe there's something going on here. I like that Janeway actually picked up on that. I like that Janeway took precautions. I really like that Chakotay had a couple of minor moments where at no point in time was he willing to push it. I love this line. Let's hope that I'm just being paranoid. I love that line. Because he is doing the thing necessary if they're under attack, which we know at that point that they're under attack. I mean, the way the scene is structured, we know that. And yet, at the same time, he is still willing to be just reasonable enough, just in case this really is a misunderstanding. Little subtle note I want to share, and I want to give credit to the director and to the actor for this. At one point in time, Chakotay's on the bridge, at the helm actually, with one other person on the bridge, some ensign or lieutenant whose name I honestly don't even remember. And he says something to her, and she doesn't respond immediately. And he just kind of looks, he's doing his thing, he stops for like a millisecond, looks to the side, and then hesitantly looks behind him to see if she's still there. Tiny, subtle little thing. But I loved that. I actually rewound just to see it again to make sure I wasn't like imprinting it onto the thing. Like, no, he really did that. Another nice thing, and this was again intentional by Lisa Klink, they deliberately went out of their way to have a lot of guest stars in this episode. Not just in the alien races, I'll talk about that in a little bit, but also to flesh out the crew a bit. And I like that. It is way, way, way too common. And this has been true since TNG, really. TNG really started the clubhouse mentality of Star Trek. Not that I'm bashing TNG, I keep saying negative things about TNG to try and emphasize that a lot of these things didn't start in Voyager or Enterprise or whatever. They started back in TNG. It's just TNG was also an amazing show. But the clubhouse mentality, you know what I'm talking about. But if you don't, I'll explain very briefly. 3 hours later. No, the idea that the ship is basically being run by 12 people. Now, TNG also went out of its way several times to combat that, to have totally random people who would show up for 3 or 4 episodes just to show that there's other crew on board. Voyager, in particular, was really bad about that, though. And actually, Enterprise was the worst. Enterprise was incredibly bad about that idea. I'm sorry, it really was. But Voyager was still kind of pretty bad about that. The idea that the main crew are basically the only crew. There have been some exceptions to that. But this episode was a definite step in the trying to show that there's crew other than the main club, other than the bridge crew. And I like that. I mentioned the other guest cast. There's several scenes that are actually dedicated towards the viewpoint of the villains. And I think that was a nice touch. It was helpful to show them their perspective, show their desperation, show their anger, show their confidence, show their personality. We got to learn a lot about the way they function and indeed, I think, their culture, because we got to see them when they weren't pretending, when they had no one around to posture for. And we also got to see a lot about them and their culture when they did have someone around to posture for. But again, I'm saving that for last. Excuse me. What do we got here? I mentioned earlier that the first act was the escalation, 12 minutes in. I wonder what it would have been like if this episode was written in a different format. Imagine an episode where the first 3 acts was the escalation, like normal. And for the first 3 acts, things are just getting weirder and worse and weirder and worse. I actually have a parallel of this, although this episode I'm about to mention also did this improperly. Remember Me? TNG, a Dr. Crusher episode, arguably my favorite Dr. Crusher episode. I don't mean that as a dig. I do genuinely like that episode. In that episode, with the exception, and you know what it is if you've seen that episode, we didn't really figure out what was going on for quite a while in, except for the exception. So I guess I should say she didn't figure out what happened for quite a while in. So the mystery was built up for a very long time, and then bam, and then it was like a race to the finish line from the end there. And I think that would have been interesting if they tried that format here. Imagine if the crew had not been vanishing every 9 minutes, but rather every 9 hours. Or something along those lines, a much longer period of time. So that over the course of the first 3 acts, we have a much more, frankly, horror feeling, a much more creepy, lonely kind of vibe as the ship slowly empties of people one by one to be replaced by these aliens who are just kind of sitting there doing nothing and being innocent acting and rolling really high on their deception rolls. And it would have been a completely different perspective, because then we would have gone to Act 4, and by Act 4, like the final person gets transported over, Chakotay, and then in Act 4, it's like, oh my god, if they did this, though, I don't think it would have been like Chakotay finds out they're bad guys and then transported. I think he would just be resigned to his fate and then get transported over. And then he finds out that for the last several days, this side of the crew has been working to get them free, and it's the Nerians, and oh my god, that kind of a thing. But the more I thought about it, and I really did think about this and like pictured scenes and whatnot in my head as I was taking care of Jaina, and I don't think that would have worked as well. I really like the format they went with. The 1-act escalation, 3-act payoff really, really worked in this case. So I don't think I would actually meddle with it. Just food for thought. I guess I have one more thought before I get to the big thing. And that is the fact that I really, really love the very concept, and every now and again I have what I call a thought explosion. It's not a literal explosion, no. I mean, picture like a single thought that branches out to 1,000 thoughts, that each branch out to 1,000 thoughts. That's why I call it the thought explosion, because it's just all this thought that just branches out so much, and occasionally I have to reel myself in because I'm thinking too much. Please tell me I'm not the only one who has that happen to him. Anyways, so like I had this thought explosion when it came to thinking about the cultures that could grow, the societies that could be formed amongst these prison habitats, amongst the people who are captured here and are stuck here for days, months, and indeed years. We mentioned that one guy actually spent 9 years just to get that one thing working, which means he was here for longer than that. Think about what kind of things can grow that. And when he comes over, and he mentions in passing the previous species had no concept of a barter system. That one line just got me thinking. And him wanting to trade with them for something as simple as food. When you have a society that is that small, a basic barter system can actually function. The reason a barter system can't work in real life is because we are too large as a society, both in terms of landmass and distance, and in terms of population. But when you're that small, and the people you want to trade with are right over there, yeah, that can totally work. And it's an interesting concept, and I just love the concept of, the way he says it, welcome neighbor, the idea of having neighbors, the idea of having coordination and cooperation and trying to share ideas and share entertainment, these kind of societies building amongst these prison races. I know that the ones that interact with each other are the exception, not the rule, but nevertheless, it was just an idea that fascinated me to the point where I think I might use that idea in a story in the future just because I love that. So, let's talk about the Nerians. Now, before I get into the really big thing, one side note, their method of conquest absolutely fascinates me. It really does. And I have to wonder, though, how well would it work on certain other races we know? How well do you think the Klingons would have responded to random members of their crew vanishing and being replaced by random members of this alien race, no matter how innocent they act? No, you're not with me? How about the Kazon? Now, granted, the Kazon are stupid. So let's go a little bit further. How about a Romulan ship? How about a Cardassian ship? It's fascinating to think how few of the Beta and Alpha Quadrant races, in my opinion, this ruse would have worked on. And it's not the first time I've said that, too. And I just find myself curious what they would have done if the Romulans just started tossing them all in the brig and whatnot as they tried to figure it out, or just shooting them when they showed up. That thought being done, though. One more race. I actually wrote this down as a special note. How do you think this particular trick would have worked on the Vidians? I'll leave you to think about that as long as you'd like to. The Nerians are a fascinating example of the research tree taken to its furthest extent. Anyone who's played virtually any type of 4X game, Civilization, Master of Orion, Alpha Centauri, Spore to an extent, they have several methods of advancing your group, your organization, your civilization, your race, your species, whatever. And one of those is almost always research. Now, it's always expensive and very time-consuming to really push into research, but at the same time, if you get far enough ahead in research, you have such an overwhelming advantage because you are so much more advanced. I mean, that makes sense, right? If Star Trek, if the United Federation of Planets, even in the original series time, decided to go ahead and contest themselves with, oh, I don't know, our real life, everyday life right now, while we certainly have plenty of tech that can hurt them, they are so much more advanced than us that we don't actually stand a chance. Not really, not in the long term, because they have such a technological advantage over us. The Nerians are that concept taken pretty much literally. They are a people who conquer through science, through technology, through advancement, peacefully. They have such advanced technology, they can beam through shields. The point of that is made. Yes, I know this is Voyager, and yes, I know they're incredibly inconsistent with beaming through shields, and yes, I know they did that on TNG as well. Blah, 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 blah. Point being, they could beam through the shields without effort. They could beam from light years away without effort. That's pretty damn impressive. They could beam basically virtually untraceable. It took extensive effort by the smartest people on board to manage to figure out that what was happening was an artificial phenomenon. And that's as far as they got, you know. And then they set up this prison ship, which is beautifully designed, and don't forget, the whole way they start this is they scan your computer, figure out how your computer works, and figure out how your language works, so they can understand you, your culture, your temperature requirements, you know, what kind of biome you need, make one for you in their holographic or replicated biomes. They never actually specify on that. And then, you know, do this whole transference thing. It just struck me as a wonderfully fascinating way to conquer. Because it is conquest, let's make that clear. These people are taking territory. She specifically mentions they don't just take ships this way. They take colonies, they take stations. This is how they advance. This is how they expand their territory. They don't move in with guns or whatnot. And the way they act so superior, too, really strikes me as the kind of thing that might grow from someone who is so much more advanced, at least on a society level or a technological level, to everyone else, or excuse me, is so much more advanced technologically as a society than everyone else around them, that they would have that kind of attitude. By the way, I'd love to watch these guys be introduced to the Borg. I'm sure the Borg would see them as candy, but moving along. That it's and the idea, I mentioned the cultural implications earlier, the idea of these people who are so smug and self-satisfied because they think they're not actually doing anything really wrong. The whole attitude is, well, with all our technology and all our power, we could have just killed you. But we didn't. We decided that we are better than you, and we're just going to go ahead and peacefully take your stuff. And we're going to take better care of your stuff than you would have. You know, that whole idea really resonated with me, and I love... I love the idea of this it's hard to explain what I'm trying to say here. Most people think technology is like one line that's being advanced, and that is completely and utterly not true. Technology is more like a billion, no, maybe that's an exaggeration, a few thousand lines. They're all advancing at different rates, you know. And to explain what I mean a little bit, and this is hard to understand as well, but because it's so rare to see this exemplified in the modern era now, but it is entirely possible for culture group A over here to be way more advanced in field A or B than this group over here, which is also more advanced in field C and D than this group is, because technology is branches. It's not like you just get better at tech. You don't get better at innovation. You don't get better in general at science. You get better at what you're focusing on, you're researching, right? So the idea that these people have literally gotten to the point where their military capacity, their ability to go, you know, quickly, their swift, faster than light travel, armament, defense, the kind of things that would be included with the necessities of a faster than light ship. For example, the capacity to cancel out momentum, all that sort of stuff. Maybe stuff that they are either lacking in or otherwise are just inferior to all these vessels and ships and stations that they are conquering. And yet they have focused so heavily on transportation, matter replication, computation. The fact that they could basically slip into the Voyager computers undetected, completely decipher it, and know exactly and be able to extrapolate from that data, food and entertainment and location, for God's sakes, all the things that they could do about that are amazing, that they could actually pull that stuff off. So it just speaks to that kind of an unusual form of stagnation, in that it's stagnant, except for this one part right here, which is getting really, really good and better all the time. And I also mentioned that's an unusual form of stagnation because we have actually experienced that in real life at many points in our history, arguably including right now, where certain aspects of life are advancing and everything else is staying exactly where it is. I don't want to get too much in commentary because that's not the point. The point is I find that concept fascinating for a fictional race, and I really would have loved to see more of the Nerians. Nobody spoil this for me, please, because I still have not gotten a chance to play Delta Rising. But this is another race I would really love to see more of in Delta Rising. So I'm done. I'm done rambling. Great episode. Love the episode. Next episode is most often voted the best episode of all of Voyager. For those of you who don't know what we're walking into, I hope you enjoy along with me. See you there, guys.